again is Christina Nitsilova. I am the Urban Development Officer at Community Land Scotland, and we are the representative body for community landowners in Scotland. And our main areas of work are policy around land reform. We do a lot of awareness raising amongst communities and other audiences to promote community ownership. And we also work with groups to provide support on their community ownership journey. We do a lot of community learning exchanges because the wealth of our network really is our knowledge. So if you'd like to find out more about our organization, you can have a look on our website. And without further, one more thing to say. This is the third session for today's kind of online series of webinars all about community ownership. So we started this morning with an introduction and overview of kind of the community ownership story in Scotland, which was delivered by our team. And then earlier on, we heard from Community Land team of Scottish Government about the community right to buy and the various routes into ownership through that. And now we are learning about community asset transfer, and we're pleased to have Lynn Molson from Community Ownership Support Service here to share her insights. And Lynn, if it's okay, I'll hand over to you now, and I'll mute myself fine. And I'll speak to you after your presentation.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Justina. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my home office. So I'm just going to talk for 32 minutes if it goes exactly to plan, and then we should have plenty of time for Q&A. So if you want to do that in the chat box, then that's going to be picked up by Kerry and Christina, and then I'll have a look afterwards and we can get going with any questions. So I'm Lynn Mollison. I'm the COS advisor, Community Ownership Support Service advisor for the area of Edinburgh, West Lothian, Stirling, and kind of out towards the M74, so Lanarkshires, and a little bit into Fife and some of Edinburgh. So that's my kind of area. So I'm just going to make sure that this PowerPoint works. There's always a bit of a technical hitch to start with. Here we go. So just a little bit about COS. We're part of the Development Trust Association for Scotland, DTAS. I'm sure many of you have heard of DTAS, but if not, then you can look up their website. They're a member-led organisation for community anchor organisations. So COS is funded by the Scottish Government, and basically there's a COS advisor in all 32 local authority areas. So the good news is you don't need to become an expert in asset transfer if you're an intermediary organisation. We're here to help you as well. So if you have a client that wants to do an asset transfer of a publicly owned asset, so that's the difference really between what we do and what Dave's team does and other colleagues, is that we focus on publicly owned assets only, and we deal with the asset transfer of those assets into community ownership. We also support the public bodies themselves, now called relevant authorities in the Act, and that's really to help people get used to what they have to have in place for this legislation. There's quite a lot involved for an RA, and local authorities are updating their systems all the time. We've been doing this since 2011, so we're here to share that expertise with you, and we share that obviously all the time with community groups. So this is the Community Empowerment Act, and I'm not going to go into the other parts that I've highlighted. Dave Thompson will have talked about this part, community right to buy, in detail earlier. The part that I'm going to talk about is part 5. But what I would say is that the groups that are eligible for asset transfer are usually, especially if they're communities of place, they're likely to be eligible for community right to buy if they're geographic community, and they are likely to also be able to do participation requests. So I've just highlighted those as sometimes if a group is looking for an asset, what they might actually be looking for is to save a service. So for instance, they may have come forward for an asset where they run a youth service, and taking on that asset would actually be a real stretch of their mission. Asset management is not the same as running a youth service, obviously, and sometimes a participation request is more appropriate there, where the group is actually able to go to the relevant authority and use that power to say, actually, we want to be part of delivering youth services in the area. So it's good to bear in mind that there are different parts to this act that may be more suitable, depending on what the community group is coming forward for. So what is community asset transfer? Obviously, some of you will know this already. So it's a process really to allow the community organisation to take over the publicly owned land and buildings. So obviously I'm emphasising this publicly owned part. It is not just about full title. I think there's a bit of a misconception sometimes that when we talk about community ownership, in my mind, I'm thinking it may be full title transfer, but it also could be a lease, and also there is the power to manage under a management agreement. So there are 3 different aspects to this that an eligible community group can use this, the powers, with the rights within this part of the Act to ask to manage, lease or own. We also I just want to mention this other bit, that if the land is put up for sale or for lease, then it is out with the community asset transfer rights. It's really just about putting in a bid, and that is a commercial transaction. Now, it's a grey area, because there are sometimes cases where an asset has been on the market for some time and basically it isn't selling, in which case a relevant authority may well say, actually, we would welcome an asset transfer application from your group. That's fine, but just to say that if you're responding to a sale, it isn't an asset transfer, it's simply a bid. So assets are, and I'm sure Dave's gone into this, any land or buildings or other structures like the bridges, etc., but it doesn't involve people, equipment. And so when the legislation talks about land, it obviously means land and buildings. So the key points in the Community Empowerment Act for asset transfer: the relevant authorities have all produced asset registers. Now, no one can actually trawl every single, especially if you are a local authority with a large quantity of assets, you have not been able to trail all your titles going back right through the Sassenes and all of the rest of it. So it's to the best of their knowledge. And also, it's also the assets that, say, a local authority leases from someone else. So all of those should be in asset registers. They should be easily accessible on websites and in libraries for community groups. That would be what we would say is it's a good place to start if you're not sure what assets are available in your area that are publicly owned. Then accessing the asset register is a good place to start. You can request information on the asset, and we would encourage groups to do this. So if there is an asset that you're interested in, contact the owner, the public body, and ask for as much information as you can, the running costs and all of that kind of thing. As I mentioned earlier, you've got the right to seek management, lease or ownership. Assets do not have to be on the surplus to requirements list. So obviously I've put that in red because this is another of the kind of asset transfer myths, I would say, that are out there, that in the past this was the case, that assets would be listed by local authorities as surplus to requirements and would be made available for asset transfer. This no longer is the case. that all assets are technically available if they are publicly owned. There's a presumption of agreement, and what that means in practice is it's a sort of difficult, but if you can imagine that there is a presumption of agreement in the favour of the community group unless there are reasonable grounds for refusal, and reasonable grounds is quite a wide definition, but what we would say is that economics alone would not be a reasonable ground for refusal. So if a community group is coming forward with very strong community benefits, then the price that they are offering is significantly lower than the valuation. That doesn't mean that the relevant authority can refuse that application based on the fact that the price is not high enough. All the community benefits need to be taken into account. So it's a much more nuanced process than what existed before. There are clear timeframes for responses, but I've put in brackets here, from validation, because typically a lot of public bodies have a two-stage process for community asset transfer, or CAT as we call it. And the first stage is really an inquiry, an expression of interest, and isn't part of the formal asset transfer under Part 5. There are no rights that go along with that bit. That is just a kind of getting to know you stage. The validation is the point from which the relevant authority receives your full asset transfer request form, and it is considered to be complete. At that point, a validation notice should be issued, and there's a formal kind of template for that. That is the point at which the rights for the time frames kicks in. So it's only at the point when you have a validation date confirmed either by email or letter to say that in 6 months' time we will make a decision based on the information you've given us. And in that 6-month period, there's a bit of kind of negotiation and seeking further information, perhaps on business plan or feasibility, that sort of thing. Applications are published online with all the relevant personal information redacted. There's an appeals procedure. It's a two-stage appeals procedure. The first part of the appeal, if you are not happy with the outcome of your asset transfer request, is an internal review within the relevant authority themselves. If you are still not happy with the outcome of that, then you have got a last recourse of appeal to the Scottish ministers themselves. So it's a robust appeals procedure, and there are annual reports made at the end of June every year by all relevant authorities affected by the Community Empowerment Act Part 5 to the Scottish Government. And that will be, you know, how many asset transfer requests did you receive, and what help did you provide, and how did you respond, what was the outcome. So that gives you an idea that there is a kind of trail for what's actually happening to your application. So the types of organisations that can come forward for asset transfer, and there is a distinction. So I've just highlighted them in this one slide, that there's a geographic community, which is basically the obvious community of place that, you know, exists, an organisation that exists to represent an actual physical place. And then there's a community of interest that is connected through common interest. So a typical community of interest could be a sports club of some kind. Now, we all know in our lives, in the urban setting in particular, but I think just about anywhere, we cross over all of these all the time. So we might live in a certain area and belong to a certain physical geographic area, but we've also got lots of communities of interest that we're part of. So there's different parts of the Act, and there's different powers and different abilities for each of those types of communities. So who can make a request? It has to be a community transfer body, a CTB, that makes the request. This body has to, first of all, be a community controlled body. And what does that look like? So it's the classic organisation that exists in the voluntary charitable sector, an open membership, so the membership must be open to anyone who wishes to join and share the aims of the organisation, that is over a certain age, usually 16, the voting age in Scotland. There must be a minimum of 20 members. The organisation has to be controlled by the membership, so the management structure has to be elected by the membership and is accountable to that membership. So it has to be a clear two-tier organisation, not just a single tier with just the management committee. There has to be membership. There needs to be a very clear community benefit purpose, and that any surplus profits of any kind or income of any kind is applied for the benefit of that community, so to fulfill whatever it says in the governing document. So there's a minimum requirement for a community of interest or place to be able to request below market value management, lease or ownership. That would be the minimum requirement, that they are a community controlled body. So the first starting point for all of us as intermediaries in this sector is, can we see your governing documents? That's what people will ask, because they're trying to see, we're all trying to see whether or not you could be classed as a community controlled body. For full title, this is in addition to being a community controlled body, there are 3 structures, and they're the same 3 structures that were talked about earlier. They are the structures in the Community Empowerment Act that are deemed, oh, apologies, I'll go back, I don't know what happened there, yeah, technology. So a CLG, the company limited by guarantee, as in not limited by shares, so not for profit. A SCIO, the Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisation, which is a charitable company. And a BENCOM, oh dear, we're going to have a jump around, I do apologise, I don't know how to stop that. A Community Benefit Society, a BENCOM, that we used to talk about before. If you haven't heard of that before, it's a co-op structure, we know lots about it, but I'm not going to go into that in detail here. If you want to know more about it, you can email me afterwards and I'll tell you individually. I can point you to where you could find out more about BENCOMs. All of these structures must have a dissolution clause, and basically it states that if the organisation was to wind up, I'll try just hovering my mouse over this to stop it. No, sorry. If the organisation was to wind up, that it's clear where the assets are going, that there's basically an asset lock, that it goes to another eligible transfer body or a charity, and at the end of the day, if nothing else, back to Scottish ministers. I've put this in, what about KICs, because it's actually asked quite a lot, but basically KICs are not registered as automatically eligible, as an eligible structure for a community transfer body. I'll not go into reasons why, but if a community group believes that their rules actually do fit the requirements for asset transfer, that they are a community transfer body, but they happen to have a KIC, limited by guarantee structure, they can ask to be designated, and that's a separate legal process. It's a request process to Scottish ministers to be designated for asset transfer. So that is there as an option. So how will the request be assessed? So it's really, as I mentioned earlier, about the public benefits. That's the point of doing an asset transfer. It's saying, actually, we believe our organisation could make better use of this asset. It's maybe underused. It's maybe, needs some work done. That would be quite typical given the climate that we've been in for a long time now. There's been a lot of underinvestment in a lot of the public realm. So economic development, regeneration, health, well-being, environmental well-being. Best value, it's a whole other area, but it also has to be able to demonstrate best value. So basically, if this was to go to market, which is the other obvious alternative, that what you're offering would be best value in terms of value for money and value for outcomes. So thinking about it in that way, that the group itself actually has the capacity to be able to deliver. And that's a tricky one, because lots of groups that come to us to begin with are new groups and they don't have a track record. And if the building itself is large and complex, then it's going to be a long journey. That's just simply the case. It's going to be a long journey before we can get to the point where a group is actually able and ready to take on a complex building on their own with a whole lot of services to run. So impact on the public body's functions, that has to be thought through, and the asset transfer request forum actually gives the opportunity to state how your proposal would fit in with a wider local plan. So there's often, every public body will have a plan for how they want to deliver services locally. So it's really important that an asset transfer request fits in with that wider regional plan. And most importantly of all, that there's a lot of community support demonstrated. If there is any kind of conflict with other community interests, it's very important to get that sort of thrashed out at the start. And it's especially important that if a community of interest is putting in a request for an asset, that there's been a lot of groundwork done with the surrounding geographic community, so that you can demonstrate that that community has the support of the geographic community, and we avoid a tension between the geographic community and any proposed community of interest that may wish to take over what might be the last community centre or the last public asset in an area. So that kind of thing has to be thrashed out before an asset transfer request is put in. It's really important to consider the funding issues right at the start, because I think we all know that right now especially it's really difficult to access funding. And you know, you can read this slide later yourself, but what I've said here really is that Scottish Land Fund tends to be the port of call to fund both community right to buy and asset transfer, but SLF is only suitable for communities of place, for geographic communities. So although as a community of interest, you may be eligible, for instance, for a lease, if you wish to own, then you would struggle to be eligible for SLF, for the Scottish Land Fund. And as a result of that, you would also not be eligible to apply to them for stage 1, which is where a lot of the communities that do asset transfer seek funding to be able to do the feasibility study, to be able to get a valuation, and architects to look at the building, an engineer, all of that sort of thing. That can be really, really difficult. It's very difficult to access funding to pay for legal fees. So if you are negotiating a lease, heads of terms can be quite a complex negotiation. It's getting the funding to help you to engage someone legally to support you in that, and for the building condition surveys like roof structural reports that I've mentioned. We're also finding now that it's really becoming increasingly difficult to get development funding, that Scottish Land Fund will fund the acquisition and maybe a small amount of bridging funding to be able to open the doors. Maybe there's a disabled toilet missing or something like that, but they don't do core development funding. So that if the building that a group is planning to take on is in a poor condition, we would really say that as intermediaries, we all have to be talking tough at the start to say, okay, where are we going to get the money for this? What's happening locally? What kind of wind farms are around? Who's been getting money through the capital regeneration fund? Because that has to be a partnership, as you'll know, between a community organisation and the local authority. That is for local authorities and groups to work together to access that. But that's generally for big projects. Small halls and things like that wouldn't really be suitable for the capital region, not typically anyway. So really the funding is a challenge. Let me just go to the next slide. So I've mentioned the wind farms, crowdfunding. So there's Crowdfunding Scotland now out there. You can contact them. Community shares. So there's a community shares unit based in DTAS, Community Shares Scotland. They would be able to help. But the important thing to know is that a community share issue can only be done through a CBS, the Community Benefit Structure. Loans, Triodos Bank is a big lender in this area, Charity Bank, Unity Bank, and CIS, Social Investment Scotland. I'm sure there are others. I'm just doing a quick gallop here about the main ones. I'm just going to give you a little picture of community ownership in Scotland. So this was done by the Scottish Public Health Network last year, so it's relatively current. You can read this slide later, but I think the main points to note are that the least and the most deprived areas have the least asset transfer requests. So the most deprived areas and the areas that are considered to be the wealthiest are actually not putting in that many asset transfer requests. At least that was what the research revealed. The highest activity in remote rural areas, which kind of makes sense when you think about services that are available in those areas. People often end up responding and managing them themselves. We did a snapshot from Glasgow City, and again, you'll get the slides, excuse me, where we pulled together 70 community groups that had come forward and asked Glasgow City Council for an asset transfer over the last 3 years since Part 5 went live. And interestingly, our findings were that the most deprived urban communities were showing the most interest in assets in Glasgow. And the majority of these were from newly formed organisations, particularly communities of interest, and also from established geographic development trusts or anchor organisations. So this is just the same information really showing you based on the deciles from the SIMD classifications. So the decile number 1 is the 10% most deprived data zones in Scotland. So you can see that 36% of the requests in Glasgow came from that decile. It's interesting that these communities are the ones that are actually going, do you know what, we really want to do an asset transfer. We really want to take over this asset, deliver services. And based on the types of organisations that are coming forward, this is a useful way to look at asset transfer. That the Joseph Rowntree community organisations that control assets, they produce this kind of definition of the different stages, and I think again you can read it in detail later, but you'll be able to, we all recognise where different organisations that were involved in actually sit, and individuals coming together to take on an asset. We say many of these would fit into the startup definition. So the types of organisations again coming forward to show the different types of how that fits into these definitions. That the community developer are the most established organisations. These are your anchor organisations, the long-term development trusts and the like. They are communities of geography, and they're likely to come forward for assets. But if you can see that startup and steward are also coming forward. Startup, there's a lot of communities of interest, at least in this particular sample. And I would say that actually from my own experience of asset transfer over the last nearly 8 years, that would bear up, that we get a lot of communities of interest in urban settings coming forward. for assets or interested in being involved in some way in asset transfer, sometimes in partnership with others, and they're often at the start-up stage. So that's me. I'm pretty much bang on, I think, from where I said I would be. So what kind of, I'll stop sharing now actually, and then that will make it easier, I think, for us to see the questions and people.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Lynn. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So we have a couple of questions coming in. Please, everyone who's in the call, feel free to add to the list.
Okay, I can see them now.
Okay, great. So we've got
slides
one.
will be available afterwards, yes.
Yes. I've already dealt with a few of them.
Okay. I think it might be easier then, Christina, if you just tell me the ones that I should be looking at.
Great. So there was a comment from Dan around the future look of Scottish Land Fund and whether you have any thoughts on kind of the capital and revenue makeup of it.
No, I mean, no, not really. I mean, the land fund itself, it's for the land fund really to make up their own mind about this, Dan, to be honest. As you'll know, the land fund is coming to an end, March 2021. So really, they will be reviewing all of the cases that have come forward and have been funded. And just as we did with Glasgow, I think the land fund will be looking at the same sort of study for all of the funds, the iteration of that fund so far. You know, is the picture changing? If there are more groups coming forward of a certain ilk, then does does support need to change? I mean, I don't think I'm the best person to answer that, basically, sorry.
Yeah.
But the land fund is crucial. I mean, that's something that we all would, I think, absolutely support. The land fund in one form or another is absolutely crucial. And if more assets are to transfer, then obviously more money is going to be needed. And if development funding is restricted to the extent that it is right now, then obviously there needs to be wider than the land fund potentially, looking at where the problem for that, does that answer that question, might be at the moment. I think, you know, we know that there's an issue, thank you, with development funding.
Yes, well, thanks, Lynn. I think it is unknown what the future of Scottish Land Fund would be, but we're hopeful. Another question, is there a list of relevant authorities? And I would add, where can we find it? Okay, yes, there is a list of relevant authorities, and it is in the Scottish Government pages. So it's asset transfer, but you need to look under Community Empowerment Act. Mm-hmm. So it's Scottish Government Community Empowerment Act. We have a link to it on our COS website. Okay. And at the end of the slides that are going to be shared, there is the COS website, DTAS Community Ownership, nice and snappy.org.uk. So rather than remember all that, it is there. But if you're going to find it yourself, it isn't so easy to find. But if you do go on the Scottish Government website, and if you do the search for community empowerment, and then click down to asset transfer, or even just Community Empowerment Act, there's a list of relevant authorities. That's actually what you're searching, relevant authorities. So you'll see that there are the 32 local authorities, and then you'll see that there's Police Scotland, Fire, NHS. If there's difficulties, come back to either ourselves or colleagues at CLS, and we'll be able to point you towards it. But yes, there is a list. That list has been updated all the time. Some organisations are asking to be put on the list. They wish to be bound by the Community Empowerment Act. So it's not just a kind of list of people where they've just thought, oh, well, we'll just put these guys. But NHS is definitely on there, so that's a big one.
for communities to know about.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions from anyone else in the audience at this point? You can wave or you can say something in the chat box. Or in the meantime, Lynn, do you have any, I don't know, can you think of anything else to add to your previous?
There's so much to say about asset transfer. It is like all of the different parts of this act. It's involved. There's a lot to know, but as advisors, as intermediaries, I think it's just important to know where to go to be able to get that kind of expert help. So we're here, we can help you. We're also just working in partnership at the moment. It's launching next week. We are transferring our physical manuals in asset transfer, and we have 6 of them, and we're transferring them into a webinar format. Now, these are aimed at communities that are interested in asset transfer. So if you are an intermediary and you would like to work with us to deliver in-depth asset transfer webinars for so if you're working, say, I think Sandy Mathers, I know Sandy. So if you were like Sandy and you were in Aberdeen and you were bringing together a group of communities that are, you know, maybe a few folk have hello Sandy, a few folk have contacted you and said, I'm interested in asset transfer, then we can deliver webinars in partnership with you. So this is available on our website. I know it reads backwards, that's the trouble. But it's an introduction. We
can see it okay, actually.
Oh, is it? Oh, that's fine. It's me that is looking at it. I am backwards. So an introduction to asset transfer, that's available on the COST website, download anyway. But it's much easier to understand if you're listening to a webinar, at least we hope so anyway. And we're putting it into a format where there's a lot of exercises that people can do as they're going through this. So it's like a kind of checklist. Have you got this? Have you got that? How have you consulted your community? Do you need some help with your governing documents? Do you know what that is? That sort of thing. So just to say that's happening, and if you want to contact us to roll that out in your area, then feel free. We have 6 of the manuals in asset transfer. So it starts from 1 and goes to 6, which is facilities management. So I have to say it's going to take us a while to get all 6 into webinar format, and maybe reality will have changed as well and we can actually have some physical meetings. But we have got these resources, so it's in feasibility, business planning, facilities management. So any of those aspects of asset transfer that you have got groups going through, then you can contact us if you want to see those resources or have those resources for your group. So that's all I would add.
Right.
I think there were a couple more questions there, aren't there?
You have inspired more questions.
Good.
Okay. You mentioned not kicks for full title. Does the same apply for long-term leases management? No.
So a kick, the community interest company, it depends how it's set up. It's like everything else. So if the kick is set up and would qualify as a community controlled body, so if the kick is a not-for-profit kick, as in limited by guarantee, right, and not by shares, then it may qualify, but it would have to have a membership structure. So it's less about there's a problem with kicks and more about they're not a structure that has been listed as this is the kind of structure that would definitely enshrine community ownership. The CLG, the SKIO and the CBS, because they are democratically controlled by the membership just by the virtue of being, if they're a two-tier structure, the KIC is more problematic. So if the KIC can qualify as a community controlled body, i.e. it has membership and the membership control the organisation, then they could potentially be eligible for lease or for management agreement. And there are lots that have over many years, long before this act. There are sports organisations that particularly that have been set up as KICs that do have leases and management agreements to use community buildings. It's problematic when it comes to title. But we do have one, the Dornoch KIC, they were about to apply to be designated, but they are structured almost like a kind of anchor organisation. And they didn't want to change the structure. It worked fine for them. So it really is about how this organisation looks. If it's a social enterprise that's been set up by a social entrepreneur and is controlled by that social entrepreneur, it won't be eligible for any aspect of this. Does that answer that? Hopefully that answered that.
I think so.
Okay.
Thank you. Another question, can you suggest how to communicate with people for support in COVID-19 times?
Oh gosh, well, it's really, you know, I've seen some brilliant documents coming out of organisations like, actually SENSCOT have got a really good document on sport, if people have seen that. The SENSCOT has got thematic groups for people that are maybe not aware. Social Enterprise Network Scotland, they've got groups on culture, sport, health, and each of those have developed, I've certainly seen one for sport that is to support organisations to reopen sports centres. Now that actually affects a lot of our clients. Sport and the delivery of that kind of club is delivered in a lot of community assets. So to answer that, I don't have that expertise. I'm just like everyone else. I'm looking at the 4-phase plan, and certainly for some of my clients that are doing asset transfers now, I have produced a couple of COVID 2-pagers to go with their business plans that basically says, okay, in this phase, we can do some outdoor eventing. How would we go about doing that? And it's really knowing your asset inside out and knowing, you know, can we make use of a car park, for instance? Do we need to request the hire or of a kind of cover of some kind? Do we need a marquee cover? You know, outdoor markets are going to be allowed in July. So, you know, it's just keeping abreast, I suppose, of, but I would say that if it's sport, that SENSCOT, the SENSCOT sport, reopening your sport centre is actually very good. I'm sure other people will have knowledge of, I think someone's already maybe sharing, let's have a look.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go, SENSCOT Network Sport, thank you, Michelle. So, so the Built Environment Scotland, there you go, SCVO, Built Environment Scotland. So SCVO have the COVID hub, and I would say that that's the best place to start looking. DTAS have their own internal kind of learning, that is from the network. You know, they've been meeting through Zoom geographically and capturing what different organisations are struggling with, but these are different communities across Scotland. You know, what are they finding most challenging, and where the pattern might be to be able to help with like strengthening communities funding going forward. There's going to be so much learning in this for everyone. Some groups I've got, they won't do Zoom. They can't do Zoom. You know, they haven't got anything more than a phone, and it's really hard. So yeah.
Yes,
and top tips, sorry.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's good to point out that all of support organizations like yourselves and like ourselves, although we're not physically going out to meet people. We are an email or a phone call away.
Yes.
So there's similar with the third sector support organizations. So everyone, I mean, not everyone, but a lot of us are still working and able to be contacted. So do.
Absolutely. I mean, there are some opportunities here, as there always are, for a much deeper kind of thinking about an asset. I mean, we certainly found that when I've been thinking about how could this particular asset respond, because so many are dependent on having the public come across the door. So it really is about weighing up how do we open safely, and that is going to be an ongoing conversation. But there's some very good stuff coming out of TSIs as well in areas supporting people, phoning round different client groups, getting volunteers mobilised to respond locally. I think the community and voluntary sector has shown that it's the last line of defence in the public landscape, that communities are actually working really, really hard to keep this machinery going and to actually make sure that people have got food and medicine and a wee bit of chat, even if it's just a phone call, like once or twice a week, just a wee bit of chat. Communities have been brilliant.
Yes, and a quick plug, Community Land Scotland published a report last week exactly on that, how community landowners across Scotland have responded to the crisis and basically how they've showcased such amazing resilience. So I will share that with everyone as well as part of my follow-up email. And I think I saw something from GTAS today that they've been doing some videos on the same topic. So there's we're starting, a lot of good examples are starting to emerge already. And Lynn, while I have your attention here, there is one more question that will be good to answer before the end of the session from Carol. Assuming there is a strong community case and an asset is on a register, can a community make an approach even if the bodies say they're not intending to sell it?
Yes, that's the point. Absolutely. That is what asset transfer part 5 is about. It allows a correctly constituted, well, I mean, all community groups that are constituted correctly, but eligible community group to come forward and actually say, we are ready to take this building on. We have got a plan. This is our outline business plan. This is how we could make this viable and sustainable. And we can deliver all these different community benefit outcomes that are not being delivered at the moment. That's what part 5 is about. So absolutely, yes. Great. It does not need to be on the market. It does not need to be surplus to requirements or for sale or any of those things. All assets are available. All publicly owned assets are available for asset transfer.
Very good. That's a really good message to potentially end this. Nothing is out of reach.
Not always popular.
Absolutely. Well, I take it there aren't any more. Oh, thanks. Okay, thank you. I take it there aren't any more questions. If anything is outstanding, please feel free to get in touch with us and we'll direct your questions to Lynn. But as I said, I will share a lot of the links that we talked about and the presentation as well as the recording in a follow-up email in the next couple of days. So thanks, Lynn, again for
my pleasure.
Joining this.
Nice to
really useful.
See everyone. I can only see two folk. Nice to see the two folk.
Yeah, nice to see everyone. Thanks. I hope you found today's series of workshops useful. And yeah, stay